Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, the challenges facing fashion businesses in 2025. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers and panelists this afternoon. Pia Dekkers, formerly HR head at Chanel, Victoria Simon, who is in-house counsel at Vivienne Westwood, and Claire Day, who is in-house counsel at TFG. And we also have Paul Alger, who is joining us from UKFT. Welcome to you all. Since the time some months ago when we envisaged holding this particular session, looking at the challenges facing fashion brands in 2025, the world has changed, and there's no two ways about that. At that time, I think it was actually pre-Liberation Day. We then had Liberation Day, and then pre-Liberation Day was followed by the suspension of the tariffs mentioned in Liberation Day. More recently, we've had the cyber attacks on the likes of Harrods, Marks and Spencer, the Co-op, as well as Dior in France. And that of itself, I'm sure, is causing many fashion businesses to think long and hard about there, but for the grace of God, go us. So, many challenges facing fashion brands. It's not easy to be in the fashion industry at the moment, knowing where to get your supplies from and how to get them into the United States, if that is an important market for you. But let me start, first of all, from an HR perspective. Pia, if I may, what do you envisage are going to be the main challenges for fashion businesses over the next 12 months? We've seen the government's announcement of new rights for employees, whether it's in terms of the reduction in the threshold for unfair dismissal, the abolition of 0 hours, or is it simply the national insurance hikes that have occurred? Or possibly the introduction of AI, as increasingly fashion businesses, alongside other businesses in other sectors, are looking to AI to guide them as to their way forward.
Thank you, Stephen, and welcome everybody. I think it's all of the above, Stephen. I don't think it's any one thing that the mitigating factors in business, and particularly in luxury as we sit here today. It didn't start, but it was mightily affected by Brexit and a lot of people going home back to Europe. And so therefore the recruitment pool became a lot smaller. For every, say, 50 vacancies, there was one candidate that everybody was fighting over. So that started the difficulty. And I think that's been compounded also by VAT. And we can possibly talk about that from a business perspective later, but that absolutely hasn't helped at all. NI, absolutely, it just makes life a lot harder with the decreasing in terms of how we can do salary reviews, how we can remunerate people in a competitive manner and provide benefits that makes us any luxury, any retailer for that matter, an employer of choice. When it comes to employment law, it's always evolving and ever changing, and there's more experts on this panel than me in terms of that. But just looking at it from a layperson's perspective, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, because again, if you are an ethical employer, then it shouldn't bother you. And that's very idealistic, I appreciate, but in terms of from for example, a diversity and inclusion perspective, that hopefully it means that we are more encompassing and more open-minded to making sure that all employees, regardless, are looked after. So I believe 0 hours has been a hot topic for a long time, and not something that a number of luxury companies actually still entertain anyway. But the tightening of margins when it comes to NI, etc., is having an impact on what companies can do when it comes to remuneration, for example.
Thank you, Pia. And Paul, if I may, turning to you, in respect of the members of UKFT, and when you're talking with them, are you getting a lot of steam being let off with regard to the increase in national insurance contributions?
Yes, Stephen, it's the topic of every conversation, and I came out of a government meeting earlier on, and it's not just specific to fashion and textiles. Pretty much any industry where you employ people is going to be affected by this. Manufacturing industries particularly so, but so too with retail, for example, hospitality. It is a major challenge, and we have one of our members, for example, who will remain nameless, but is one of the largest manufacturers in the sector, that has been presented with a £900,000 bill as a result of the NI hike. Now, in order to cover that cost, the business has got to add, I would suspect, something in the millions of pounds worth of turnover, possibly even a figure as high as 50 million, to be able to cover just the cost of the NI increase. So it is a major challenge coming on top of all of the other challenges that I know that we'll talk about later.
Thank you for that, Paul. In terms of the other changes, well, there was the change, I think, last autumn with regard to putting obligations onto employers with regard to sexual harassment. It is the case that I'm aware that drapers have, in the last week or so, been looking at the issue of sexual harassment in retail. To what extent, Victoria, are these changes and proposed changes in legislation, to what extent do you feel that they're impacting fashion, or is it the case that, as Paul remarked with regard to national insurance, it's not simply fashion, it is other sectors?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Steve, that it is, it's not just fashion, it's other sectors as well, but predominantly within a fashion brand, obviously the HR function will need to make sure that any employee handbook, any policies are aligned with the ever-changing regulations, ensuring that training is given to employees as well, ensuring that that training is kept up to date, and also ensuring that the training is complied with and, enforced and people are doing it. So yeah, as in a nutshell, it really is not just something confined to the fashion brands.
Thank you, Victoria. Claire, moving along, one of the things that I referred to in my introduction for this session was the onset of the use of artificial intelligence. I'm hearing different things from different people. I do appreciate that fashion is one of the creative industries. But are you aware of an increasing use of AI, or is it restricted more to the technical and development side of things?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've all become very well versed with AI recently. I think it's impacting all areas of life on both the personal and professional level, and certainly the fashion industry will need to keep up with that. I know that last year I was attending one of the fashion events, and AI was actually one of the trends that they were looking at in terms of what the fashion industry was going to offer for their design. So I think it really does infiltrate everything. And obviously from a legal perspective, AI is really quite prevalent. It's something that lawyers, in my personal view, I think that we have to start embracing because we ultimately don't want it to completely wipe us out. So it's something that we can work with as lawyers, but also in the fashion industry. I know that there's platforms like ASOS that were looking at using AI on their actual platform, and I think fashion brands will start to try to kind of keep up with modern times if they can, because most of the younger generation, that's what they're growing up with, that's what they know. And it's certainly, as we're constantly told, part and parcel of the future, and we either need to get on board with it or probably, you know, fall a bit behind. So it's certainly something that the fashion industry needs to think about, because there's too many other things to worry about. So I think we've really got to be thinking about that.
I am inclined to agree with you. But I'm also aware, firstly, of some businesses. I was speaking with someone yesterday where the business has prevented its employees from using AI because they are concerned about the non-confidential use of AI, information getting out into the marketplace. And on that particular topic, Pia, in terms of limiting how employees use AI, at what point do you stop? Because it is the case, as we know, that employment law and intellectual property law can extend outside the workplace to the actions taken by individuals, for example, in creating a new design and who owns the intellectual property in that. If it's done outside of the workplace, well, I can give you the answer, but what do you feel about the use or restriction of use of AI outside of the workplace by employees?
I think it falls to Victoria's point of having clear policies and training and educating people. It's treating people like grown-ups, you know, and whereby there's an element of trusting, but it's inextricably involved. If you think about LinkedIn, for example, and people applying for jobs, their first point of contact with their CV is not a human being. It is AI. And if you don't use certain words, then you're not going to get through. But that's not a human being stopping you, that's AI stopping you. So in order for companies to get candidates, they're going through AI if they're using LinkedIn as one of their choices, not dissimilar to other places. So I think it's about clear communications and education and understanding about what people, I don't like to say can and can't do, because ruling people outside of the workplace is one thing, but it's acting responsibly and protecting the brands in that respect and helping people understand why it's important, but also understanding that it's very much part of our lives. So, and how to use it responsibly.
Indeed. And certainly one of the uses that I can envisage, I'm sure it's already happening, of AI is with regards to helping businesses determine what particular styles are going to be repeated, what particular colorways should be used in order to maximize customer attention or potential customer attention. And that probably leads through into the issue of what we call ESG, but which has, of course, very clear aspects to it. Sustainability on the one hand, and the social aspect, which we would be concerned about, and which, of course, in the United States is diversity, equality, and inclusion. Paul, you're dealing with members who have businesses, business operations in the United States that I know. I'm aware of Victoria, that Vivienne Westwood has its own operation in the United States. Claire, I have to admit, I'm not sure, but I'll guess that at least one of the brands does have a business in the United States. Open shout, to what extent, any of you, do you feel that businesses, particularly in the fashion sector, are being pulled in two different directions? One, by reference to the increasing prevalence in the European Union to give credence to what we call ESG, and on the other side of the Atlantic, much less so.
It's tricky. It's such turbulent times at the moment, and obviously there are constant problems for the fashion industry and for retailers, constant hurdles that they have to get through. There's a lot of EU regulations and compliance. You know, I'm myself am actually working a lot on the general product safety regulation at the moment. Then there's all the tariff situation. That's also another, you know, we're just, basically being there's one problem after the other at times when it comes to this type of thing. But obviously you have to be able to ride those waves and see them out and make sure that, you know, when you're an in-house lawyer, that you are properly ensuring that all of your obligations are met. And I think they're always taking support from lots of different people in the business. I personally have taken advice from Paul before with UKFT. You were very helpful, actually, Paul. Back just before Christmas, we were discussing the Russian sanctions and provided some very helpful advice to me via a former employer. So I don't know if you remember that conversation. Yeah.
Thank you for the plug, and you're very welcome. I think, as Claire said, I think one of the big challenges that, and this is a 5-hour seminar, isn't it, about the about the challenges of the fashion and textile industry. I mean, one of the challenges is this mounting barrage, this responsibility of environmental, social, and governments. UKFT has just taken on a second compliance member of our team because it is the hot topic. And I think it's very clear when you asked earlier on about the difference between the European Union, the UK, and the US. The EU has been and continues to pile up regulation on regulation, GSPR, ESG, all sorts of them. We're all familiar with them. The UK has generally followed, although we haven't gone quite to the same extremes that the European Union is going to with things like GPSR. I never thought I'd say that there was a benefit of Brexit, but potentially that might be the first one I found. But also in the US, you find different states with different requirements. So, for example, anyone selling in the United States where the goods might just end up in California needs to be familiar with things like Prop 65, for example. So the US is following slowly, but in a different way. But we're also seeing, I think, on the social side, a slight move backwards on the social side now. The mood music from the US affects also what bigger brands do around the world. So my concern, I suppose, is that spirit of inclusion and diversity that we've been building up over the last 5 or 10 years could possibly start to slow down. I personally think that's a bad thing, but we're beginning to see how you don't always have to have a rule. Sometimes just the mood music that comes from somewhere actually begins to make a difference somewhere, and we are beginning to see that a little.
Thank you. Victoria, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything else everyone said on the panel. The only thing I would also add is that, you know, with these new regulations that come in, there is also a lot of consideration that needs to go into assessing the applicability of the regulation to the brand, your supply chain. It's a big task ensuring compliance. Often risk assessments need to be undertaken, steering committees set up, you know, roadmaps for implementation, creating new processes for due diligence, and also, you know, reviewing your existing framework. A lot of work goes into each and every one of these new regulations, which potentially can apply. And also a lot of horizon scanning needs to be done as well to make sure that, you know, we're prepared for what's coming up in 2026. So that's just another thing to add, something that is another challenge, which I think many brands are facing.
Well, I'm very much inclined to agree with you. Claire, if I may just go back to you. On the issue of supply chains, on the issue of vigilance in terms of supply chains, of course, up until relatively recently, it's been with regards to the issue of whether slave labor is being used, as to whether the particular cotton is being harvested by the use of slave labor, whether the particular cotton is actually being grown in a particular way, or whether pesticides are being used, or whatever happens to be. But Claire, do you feel that we're on a turning point here between businesses that want to trade in the United States, having regards to the issue of tariffs, and that conflicting as to where actually it makes the best business sense to source supplies from when it comes to having regards to the business's ESG commitments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, as we've already alluded to, there's a lot of work from a fashion brand's perspective as to what goes in to comply with the just general sustainability and the EU regs and the various laws, nationally and otherwise, and just from a general ethics point of view, from the public point of view of where they want to shop, it's very important to the public now to be looking at sustainability issues, and it's obviously one of the big challenges of fashion brands. And I know that there's the new digital passport that's coming our way in terms of making sure that we can see the journey that a product, where it's come from. So there's tons and tons of work that goes into that. And then just when you feel that you've got all that set up and it's going in the right direction, along comes Trump with his tariffs and sets a cat amongst the pigeons, which obviously at the moment we're still a bit kind of 1 minute one thing's going on with the tariffs, and I know that from internally within our retail business we're all on tenterhooks as to what the next problem might be, and that's not even mentioning the cyber attacks. So it is difficult because retail businesses will then look at potentially changing where their supply direction is coming from, because ultimately the tariffs will impact the end consumer, and the end consumer will then not purchase from that retailer because the price is too high. So it's overcoming those hurdles, and those are constant challenges. And I think, what is more important in that moment? Is it the longer term sustainability plan, or is it to ensure that business doesn't immediately cease trading from America because the prices are just too high? There are a lot of problems, and as I say, that's not even bringing into the equation of the cyber attacks, which is a whole other problem.
Thank you, Claire. And I must admit, I did have a bet with myself before this discussion started as to how long it would take to name check the President of the United States. I'm not going to say whether I won my bet or not. But anyway, Pia, I'll come on to you in a moment with regard to a particular issue so far as the social and governance side of ESG is concerned, and which has particular resonance so far as luxury is concerned. But Paul, before I do so, members of UKFT wanting to sell in the United States, facing tariffs, but facing also the need to live up to their ESG commitments. Are they in danger of imitating Janus?
Good question. It's a very heavy question as well, because of course one of the things that we see and at UKFT, I said earlier on that we're spending a lot of time on compliance, because the burden of compliance falls more heavily on the shoulders of small and medium-sized enterprises that can't always afford to bear the cost of that additional regulation as part of their own team. And it's one of the reasons why we spent a lot of time on that. But one of the things that we also see is that there is the potential with some of these regulations that they are mutually exclusive and that they cut across each other. So it would not be right for me to take up the opportunity to mention on a perfectly good webinar the thorny structure of the product's environmental footprint, which is coming through on a voluntary basis from the EU. But we're beginning to look at that inside at UKFT from a greenwashing point of view as well. So, are we saying that if something scores very high on that particular compliance rating, that it is potentially a greenwashing issue? So some of these things are very, very complicated, and it does feel like it's an open field. It feels like governments around the world, particularly ours, are sort of really challenging the industry to manufacture ever more sustainably, ever more ethically. But as you said, and you alluded to it in your question, the consumer wants to pay no more for sustainable and ethical goods than the consumer wanted to pay for unsustainable and unethical goods. And we're going to see, I think, over the next 5 years, a real clash between what consumers think they are buying and what they want, and what the brands, and the smaller brands in particular, can afford to deliver at a price. It's becoming very, very difficult.
It is certainly becoming very difficult, and I think, in particular, the middle price brands are going to be squeezed even further. But Paul referenced, Pia, that compliance is a heavier burden on small and medium-sized enterprises than it is on the much bigger fashion businesses. I'm aware that over the last few months, a number of luxury businesses manufacturing in Italy have been investigated with regards to the alleged use of slave labour in Italy. Looking at it in particular from the luxury sector, and then I will turn to other panelists. Do you think that there is anything to suggest that luxury brands are concerned, or possibly are choosing not to look too deeply into particular situations when it comes to their own supply chains are concerned? In other words, is it peculiar what has happened in Italy or not? And I should add, for the sake of transparency, and it's certainly not luxury, we at Fox Williams, we're currently acting for clients in mounting a securities litigation claim against Boohoo, which clearly sits at the other end of the market. And that relates to what happened with regard to the use of slave labour in Leicester. So, Northern Italy, allegations, investigations by the Italian authorities. To what extent is the luxury sector concerned, and to what extent does it look too deeply or not?
In my experience, they are very concerned. Supply chain, right to the source of ingredients and components, etc., etc. And I think, coming into making sure that there's equality, that there's the governance, and it's not just about ticking boxes. It's beyond. I mean, certainly in my experience, partly from a wish to be equitable and fair, but also to protect the brands as well, because, for example, what you're quoting there, with that can damage a brand in a heartbeat. If you remember the fire and the collapse in India few years ago,
Rana Plaza, yeah,
that really did deep harm to the companies that were involved. I think the great thing is we have the likes of Fox Williams to come to, and I really truly think it's from a governance. Each company needs to have a strong base, but that's to make sure that we follow the government guidelines of all of the countries that the supply chain involves. So it's not just what are the rules in the UK, but it's also, where does the supply chain go to? Is it just Europe? Is it just France? Is it goes to the Far East, etc.? And so I would certainly say it will keep lawyers in business for a lot longer.
Well, I hope I do hope so, and certainly when it comes to governance, I know that members of a couple of departments in the firm have been involved in a number of very, very serious governance investigations over the course of the last 12 months or so. Victoria, Vivienne Westwood herself, I recall, had an exceptionally strong commitment to society. And that was reflected in the business that was created, the brand that was created by her. What, insofar as you can you share with us in terms of how that is being continued following her passing?
So it sort of links to your previous question as well, Steve, to Pia. And completely agree with what Pia said. It is incredibly important to be able to look at your supply chain to the source. We actually have a responsibility team which is dedicated to investigate, to monitor, to enforce our policies. We have a whole host of policies which we share with our suppliers and which are updated from time to time. In terms of, ongoing compliance, we've recently been working on our modern slavery statement, for example, which also, it really involves sort of a deep analysis and assessment. And, the key purpose of those statements are for transparency as well, and to ensure continuing improvements. So in terms of Vivienne Westwood's commitment to all of these sort of ESG regulations, to supply chain, transparency, etc., it's very, very key to our business.
Thank you. And Claire, Paul made the point that the burden of compliance is heavier on small and medium-sized businesses. I would actually take issue with that. I would suggest that actually it's relative, and irrespective of the size of the business, the obligations, the work that is taken, the resources that are devoted to compliance are usually reflective of the size of the business. What would you say in respect of that?
Yes,
And
yes.
I should add, I say, because I'm aware that the company has acquired and possibly is continuing to acquire various brands. So they come in different shapes and sizes.
Yes, absolutely. TFG brands did recently acquire White Stuff, which as you will all know, is a large retail outlet as well. We make sure that our compliance is aligned. I think it's important to, where you can, it's not always feasible for all brands, but to sometimes be able to do site visits at the factories as well, to hold them accountable, ask for their auditing, these kind of checklists, so that on your modern slavery statement, for example, on, as a brand, you're able to say, this is what we've done, and you can back that up with a paper trail of things that you've done. And I think, obviously the bigger you are, the more you're going to be able to have the resources to be able to go out and check that a factory is doing what they're saying. So I do agree with what I can understand where Paul is coming from. Like, obviously the bigger a company is and a brand is, I guess they've got more resources to be able to comply, and in that respect perhaps it is easier. But at the same time, in some ways, the bigger you are, then perhaps you'll be more accountable to the public. So it swings and roundabouts really, but I think the overall message is that actually compliance is really important, and whether you're small, medium or large, you should be doing it. And I think that, the likes of these larger, much larger companies that come in, from China, for example, with really low price points, I think people make an automatic assumption about them, and there's a reason for that, obviously. And so if you are in the retail industry and you're charging a good solid retail price, there is absolutely a responsibility to ensure that there's a reason that you're charging those kind of retail prices, and you should be held accountable.
Thank you. Paul, back to you, if I may. Given the challenges that we've been speaking about, particularly over the last few minutes, and also recognizing that it's not something that can just happen overnight in terms of the infrastructure consequences of the imposition of tariffs. Are members of the UKFT looking now more seriously or more intently with regard to either onshoring or nearshoring when it comes to their manufacturing? Or are they still determined, where they're not producing already in the UK, that they're going to continue to produce in the Far East?
Another very good and quite complex question, Stephen. But I would say, generally speaking, the UKFT members have either been very much passionate about onshoring, reshoring, or nearshoring. But there are members of UKFT that are also sourcing in Asia, for example, because the costs, particularly for volume, the costs of manufacturing in Asia are substantially lower. If you get the mix right and the transport and the logistics right, can be quite a lot cheaper. And topically, of course, once the UK-India Free Trade Agreement is given royal assent and comes into operation, we would expect a lot of companies that perhaps have been manufacturing in other parts of Asia would go to India because it will be cheaper. There will be no duty, our estimate is, on those goods, or very little duty, that will be phased out over time. So there are different companies that are doing different things, because even at the luxury end of the market, this is still a very price sensitive industry, which is something that I think we sometimes forget, and price is as important to Vivienne Westwood and Victoria Beckham as it is to a smaller brand. Everyone has to make profit. So I see that people are doing that. Brexit has been a challenge to the UK's nearshore supply chain. And again, this comes up time and time again. But we still see something like 70% of London Fashion Week's catwalk designers manufacturing in places like Portugal and Turkey, for example. But I think as we move on, the interesting thing is going to be that as people start to delve into this news about wonderful free trade agreements that successive governments have talked about, the rules of origin of those trade agreements are very different. Each one is different. So you have to look, and again, we do this a lot at UKFT, at where the goods are made, where the last process took place, where the fabric was made, particularly for the United States. That's a big topic at the moment when you're dealing with a country with which we don't have a proper trade agreement. Then non-preferential agreements don't have rules of origin which are written down. So you then have to look in quite a lot of detail at what it is that is likely to influence US customs, for example, to decide where a good is made. And often the fabric is actually as important, if not more important, than the last transformation. So yes, they are looking at it. Yes, they're passionate about reshoring if they're interested in reshoring. Most of our smaller brands really want to bring goods back to the UK. But if they can't, then nearshore opportunities are there and they are flexible, and most of our members use them.
Although, whilst I hear you, Paul, Pia, increased employment rights, increased national insurance, nearshoring comes with a cost.
Absolutely. On cost, it just builds and builds. And it was mentioned earlier by Paul in terms of how much more money you've got to take and net so that you are actually, enjoying a profitable business. And I think it's becoming tougher and tougher, and also with third-party arrangements as well, because of course somebody's got to put the additional cost on somewhere. So if it's direct from supplier, that's one thing, but if you've got to go through third parties, and indeed, even from an employment perspective, it costs, and sponsoring people. So now you can't just have that free movement for development and opportunities of graduates even. It's just making it harder and harder every day. And those poor people who are graduates in different things, are having to take low paying jobs because they can't get the opportunities or get onto that career ladder because people aren't recruiting, because they're restricting recruitment.
Well, indeed. Just before we move on from that, Victoria, given what we've been discussing, are there any changes? And I'm not asking you to disclose confidential information, clearly, but are you contemplating any changes in terms of the way you're manufacturing?
As far as I'm aware, no, but it's sort of alluding to what everyone has said before. Brands really do have to be good at adapting to this ever-changing landscape and thinking of creative and new ways to respond to potential tariffs, increased costs, potentially, as Claire alluded to, maybe diversifying their supply chain further, or potentially having to absorb some of these increased costs into their profit margins. I think brands really at the moment are having to respond and face quite a few challenges, and each brand is going to be completely different in sort of how they approach these challenges.
Indeed, I agree with you. And Claire, anything so far as TFG is concerned, because I would anticipate that you manufacture, I was going to say globally.
Yeah, we do manufacture globally, and yeah, not as far as I'm aware at the moment. No changes at this point in time.
Okay. Let's move on, and I do so having regard to something that I saw this morning, which was in the Times, in terms of the hit that is going to be, or is speculated is going to be taken, in the remuneration of the CEO of M&S as a result of what it's gone through over the course of best part of a month now. Cyber attacks. We all think that we have in place ways of dealing with malware. To what extent do you think, Claire, if I can start with you, it has served as a wake-up call, given the attacks that have taken place, particularly on the fashion businesses concerned, M&S, Harrods, Dior? Or do you think that it's just this month's news story, and next month, with the expiry of the 90-day suspension of Liberation Day, we'll be back on tariffs?
I think it's been a huge wake-up call to the retail sector and the fashion brands, and possibly lots of other industries as well. I think that cyber attacks, it's almost going full circle back to where we were in the beginning. Tech is so fast moving, and I think it's so difficult for with so many other things to think about when you're running a business in any way, shape or form. There's always so many things to think about, and perhaps sometimes data security and tech, it's kind of easy to think we're doing what we need to, and potentially tick boxing things, or you might have a bigger company where you might be a bit more robust with some of your tech security measures. But ultimately, when you see a huge brand like M&S having a cyber attack, and the impact of it, and the ongoing impact, I don't know about you, Stephen, but it's gone on far longer than what I was expecting. And I think it's just frightening, really, what's happened. And it's frightening from a consumer's perspective, because ultimately there's a huge data breach there, and people's data has obviously been hacked. But for the retailers, it could absolutely cripple them. And I think that it will be a wake-up call, but the problem is always that tech is so fast moving, and you have to have the right resources to be able to lock everything up and under key, and even then you still don't know what hackers are capable of. So I'm sure that it's probably not just the fashion industry's mind at the moment, but given that the hackers have specifically targeted retailers, I think a lot of retailers are probably going to be very carefully watching. And I know that we look at our security in great depth all the time. So our data security. So I think that's what will be going on in a lot of workplaces.
Yeah, I think you're right. And as you were talking, Claire, I was just reflecting. I think I'm right in saying that later this week, M&S are going to be publishing their latest results, their financial results. And given the way the share price has performed over the last best part of a month, query what is happening, and no doubt also impacting various pension plans where people are invested in M&S. We'll come back to the impact of cyber attack on businesses and what businesses are doing. But Pia, just following up from something that Claire mentioned, we have seen over the last few years the alignment of obligations on senior employees, the C-suite level, with regard to their being aligned with the ESG commitments of the businesses for which they are in the C-suite. Do you think it is possible that businesses will get around to putting particular obligations or alignments with regard to cybersecurity? Or would that be a step too far for most CEOs?
I could see it absolutely happening. I think if you go back to, just the basics of health and safety, you know, there is an obligation, there's somebody's name on that health and safety, and if you breach it, somebody potentially can go to jail. Not dissimilarly. Now, obviously, a cyber attack, unless somebody has on purpose colluded and created that cyber attack, obviously it's not breaking the law per se. But I think that accountability, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think it might cause a number of CEOs rather sleepless nights.
Yeah.
But Paul, just getting back to the general issue of the impact that we have seen on Harrods M&S, the Co-op and Dior, recognizing Co-op is not a fashion business, but the other three for sure are. Do you think that it's concerning members of UKFT, or is it just happens to be this month's thing to worry about, and next month, as I said, we'll be back to tariffs?
I think we're always on tariffs because that's the big issue of the moment. But I think for this is probably one area where the larger businesses are more obvious and more likely to be targeted than perhaps some of the smaller ones. So in some ways it's because the hacker is always going to look for the person with the ability to pay the ransom, presumably, or who's
But Paul, let me just interrupt you. The small luxury brand, the
more
small luxury
luxury brands,
brand,
if they have a high profile, could be just as
and they're the consumer data that they will hold.
could be at risk as well. So it's a topic that we talk about quite a lot. I mean, certainly within UKFT, we're also very mindful of our own obligations because we hold data and information on our members. So it is something that we are very aware of, but I think it comes not right at the top of the list of the things that we're concentrating because tariffs are higher. But I think if we were talking about the banking sector, I would imagine that's right at the top of their list because one of the things that certainly keeps me awake at night would be the thought of what happens if somebody were able to get into one of our high street banks because they are increasingly all working online and the implications of that, the cooling effect, let me use that term, that would have on our economy, on the global economy, could be substantial. And in the same way that we've seen that with the President of the United States tariff Liberation Day, the cooling effect on international and global business has been substantial. So I'm not suggesting that a fashion brand being hacked in this way is going to have the same effect, but there are other businesses that are very close to the ones that we all work with that could be affected. So it may not be the fashion brand itself that gets hacked, but what happens if their bank gets hacked? That could be very damaging to that brand as well.
A very fair observation. Victoria, cyber attacks, is that the issue at the moment, so far as you're aware, from internally within Vivienne Westwood, as well as talking with other brands?
Yeah, absolutely. So as soon as sort of I heard about the news, the first thing I did was arrange a meeting with my IT team to say, look, please brief me on every single measure we are doing, making sure that everything's up to date. We need to obviously be aware there is a risk. It does seem just in the way that, these events have unfolded that they are targeting retailers and they are in quite close succession as well. It's extremely unfortunate what's happened. And as mentioned before, I'm surprised it's gone on and has affected M&S as long as it has. I've received, as a shopper at M&S, I've received an email from them explaining that my personal data have been compromised. So it's scary from a consumer perspective as well. So it is something which we are definitely looking into and treating very seriously.
Certainly, you're not alone for sure. I'm going to turn to a particular, what I regard as a legal issue as opposed to an HR matter. And Victoria, if I may, I'll start with you. To cease and desist or not cease and desist? That is the question. When should a fashion brand pursue an infringer of its IP?
A great question, one that is often something I ask myself when I work in brand protection matters. A lot of it will depend on the extent of the infringement. If it's a clear infringement, who the identity of the infringer is, what the impact is on the business. Unfortunately, when you do operate on a global scale, there will be counterfeits made of your produce and you can't control that. But what you can do is you can try and create a strategy to try and protect your brand and prevent infringement as much as you can, have reporting mechanisms in place so that internally, these types of infringements can be handled effectively. But also what you can do is you can extend your strategies to consumers by having a brand protection reporting outlet so that consumers can notify you as well. But for cease and desists in particular, it's worth remembering that they are a tool. A cease and desist letter, it's not a strategy. To send a cease and desist letter is often the first step to something greater, potentially litigation, or having a sort of dialogue with the infringer. So it's a very good question, and it really does depend on the circumstances of each case.
Thank you, Victoria. Claire, to cease and desist or not cease and desist?
Yeah, I have two things to say about this actually. And the first one is that I think a lot of the time with counterfeit items, there are many of the large marketplace companies, platforms, shall we say, so social media platforms like TikTok, Facebook, and then there's the marketplaces like eBay and Amazon. They're where you will largely find counterfeit product. And having done quite a lot of counterfeit protection in the previous place where I worked, they've actually got a lot of their own mechanisms, reporting mechanisms, where you can actually go on and you can say, here's our trademarks, this is where the infringing product, and please take it down. And they're actually very reactive. So I would really recommend that service if you are a fashion brand and you spot some counterfeit product on one of these platforms, because I think that that's actually a much quicker mechanism than sending out cease and desist letters, which, as we know, you do have to act with caution in sending those out, because if you send them out and actually, I can't remember the specific term, but you're basically given a false allegation, then it can backfire on you legally. So the platforms that I'm talking about in terms of their internal procedures, they will take the content down. And if that provider, for example, they might say, no, this is secondhand goods, these are genuine, they have an option to get it put back up again, and you can then enter into a conversation about that with them directly. So I think that's one way in which you can deal with that matter. And the second thing I was just going to circle back to is the use of AI with counterfeit products, because there's a lot of third-party platforms out there that you can sign up to as a fashion brand, and that basically their AI bots as such will trawl the internet and will find the counterfeit product for you. And again, you have to go onto the portal and validate whether that product is counterfeit or not, but they will then take it down off the websites for you. So I find those are the mechanisms in which I find them much more easy to get counterfeit product quickly off of the internet, rather than going for a cease and desist letter, which in my experience you just don't hear back from. And to take a matter properly through the courts would cost thousands and thousands of pounds and take up a lot of time.
I hear you, Claire. Paul, in your experience, Claire's referenced the issue of groundless threats, where the brand owner threatens cease and desist, and then it's found out that actually it has been, unfortunately for the brand owner, a groundless threat. But to what extent do you feel amongst members of UKFT that there is decent knowledge of this particular area, and do they understand that there can be issues arise which can cause problems for them, or do they just, for example, suck it up and just accept that there will be infringements, and it's in a way it's a good sign that they're regarded as sufficiently commercially interesting that their particular designs are copied?
I think most of them tend not to take the view that copying is a fine form
of flattery, yes.
They don't tend to react quite that way. I think again the problem that a lot of designers have, and we all have in this industry, is everything has been done before. So or nearly everything has been done before. So you find yourself in a situation where you're having to make decisions about whether something really is original or whether it's something that has been acquired culturally, for example, or in other ways. So my perception is that smaller fashion businesses are sometimes surprised when they find that they've been copied, and also surprised by the lack of protection for companies when they are copied in this way or when their copyright is infringed. So it comes as a nasty shock. And of course, the problem is, and I think it's to Claire's answer, is that for many of them, they will come to us and start to think, well, how do I protect myself? How do I defend that design? But then are put off because they find that the cost of enforcing it is prohibitive for a smaller company, as indeed it is for a large company. Often you've heard from larger companies that it is also a major challenge. So it's one of those things that I think most companies, after a period, once they've calmed down, they move on to the next original design and the next original idea. But it's not a perfect world, I would say, and I sometimes worry that if you're not actually protecting your IP, then the IP infringers will just come at you again the next time. So it often tends to be in the UK, and this is a terrible generalized statement, but it often tends to be bigger brands that intentionally or sometimes unintentionally potentially infringe a copyright or a design right because they've seen something somewhere and think, well, actually, if we tweak it, it will be fine. But the designers don't see it that way, and it comes as a horrible shock to them.
And I could respond with regard to your last point, Paul, that you might say that, but I couldn't possibly. Last one, because we're well aware that we're about to run out of time. Pia, it's going to be an unfair question. Apologies for that in advance. But given your background, if luxury brands could choose, what do you think they would choose? To see a reversal of what we have seen in the increase in national insurance rates, or to see the resumption of no VAT for tourists coming to the UK?
It's
If
like
you could
Hobson's
choose.
choice. But
Well, indeed.
I think for luxury brands, the VAT,
Mm,
if their choice had to be made, for sure, because
indeed.
that 20% is driving business abroad.
It certainly is, and I'm very well aware of that. Okay, thank you,
But we
Pia.
would like the NI as well.
Yeah, okay. Right. So we've now reached the end. Thank you to our panelists for a most enjoyable discussion. Paul Alger from UKFT, Pia Dekkers, formerly from Chanel, Victoria Simon at Vivienne Westwood, and Claire Day at TFG. And my name's Steve Sidkin, and it has been my pleasure to host this panel discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye,
everybody.
everyone. Thank
Thanks
you.
for joining.